So our next session is kinship narratives. Family and lineage have always been a huge part of how humans conceive of themselves and their own cultures and histories. So in this panel, mythical Lesbos, ancient Mesopotamia, and Victorian England all converge on the idea of inheritance and genealogy as the past affects the present. To begin, I'd like to welcome our first presenter, Dr. Paolo Benedetto. Paolo Benedetto graduated in philology, history, and literature of antiquity classics with a thesis entitled The Foundation of Aeolian Chime, the University of Salerno in 2016, and he obtained his PhD in Greek history with a research project entitled Foundation Accounts of Aeolian Cities in Asia Minor, which is forthcoming. That PhD course is History, Cultures, and Knowledge of Mediterranean Europe from Antiquity to the Contemporary Age at the University of Basilicata in 2020. Dr. De Benedetto is currently attending the second year of that PhD course in Historical Studies at the University of Naples Federico II with a research project entitled The Aeolis in Asia Minor during Roman Times. His research interests range from the history, historiography, archaeology, and epigraphy of Asia Minor in Greek and Roman times, as he has recently approached memory, identity, and representation studies in the field of historiography. He's participated in numerous national and international conferences on history and archaeology and published 13 contributions. Dr. Paolo Di Benedetto's paper is titled Representation of the Past in Mythical Traditions of Lesbos. Thank you, Paolo. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I would like to thank the organizing committee for giving me the opportunity to report in this interesting and worldwide conference. So my presentation today focuses on the mechanisms of representing the past, the traditions of ancient Lesbos, whose history began to take shape from the 7th century BC. Through the analysis of the sources, this contribution will investigate the accounts related to the archaeology of Lesbos and the way in which these traditions can identify the of the island and in particular of its main city, Mytilene. In the ancient world, the representation of the past is an elaboration built through the contribution of different basic elements of an ethnos or a polis community. First of all, the memory of an historical which can be framed in categories of space and time. Secondly, the perception and representation of these historical events, which can be represented in different ways. What holds these elements together is tradition, which is the custodian of the historical and cultural heritage. Therefore, memory, perceptions, and tradition create history. Part of this heritage are the accounts of the so-called archaeology, namely the elaborations, literary elaborations, which a polis built its origins through a filter that for us is considered as intentionale Geschichte, according to Hans-Joachim Gerke definition. These foundation accounts, mainly consisting of myths and legends, can be anachronistic or contradictory when compared to other sources, especially the archaeological ones, and could not reflect the true historical facts, but they represent the way in which a community perceives its origins at a precise moment of its history. My aim here is not to investigate real presences, in some cases attested by archaeological data, but to study the accounts in literary sources as kind of representations of the past. Having said that, before going on to examine these witnesses, we shall see on the map where is located ancient Lesbos. As we can see on the map, the island is placed in the Aegean Sea opposite the Aeolian shores of Anatolia, exactly opposite the opening of the Gulf of Adramyttium. The two most important polis are Mytilene in the southeast, which we can consider as the capital of the island, and Methymna in the north. The oldest archaeological evidence on the islands dates back to the 10th, 9th century BC, when settlements are attested. Lesbos was one of the most important Greek areas during the Archaic period, but its ancient history has not been deeply investigated. We begin our research by first considering the foundation account of the island, which dates back to the earliest Greek myths relating to the Atrides. The ancient myth history of Lesbos is directly linked to the so-called Aeolian migration, namely the mass movement towards Asia Minor, which involved several Greek ethne from Thessaly and Boeotia in primis, and took place after the Trojan War between the 11th and the 7th century BC. Now let's see the literary sources about the archaeology of Lesbos. The migration is represented as an Aeolian expedition from mainland Greece. It took place from Aulis of Boeotia, the same place from which Agamemnon's army departed from Troy, and was organized by Orestes, son of Agamemnon, and his Pentelidae, leading to the foundation of Lesbos. Analysis only the text sections of the sources that interests us will be considered. Let's read now the tradition reported by Strabo. It is said, in fact, that Aeolian migration is 4 generations earlier than the Ionian one. Orestes, in fact, was at the head of the expedition, but after his death in Arcadia, his son Penthilus succeeded him 60 years after the Trojan War. Thereafter, his son Archelaus led the Aeolian expedition. Then his youngest son Gras led the greater part of the army across to Lesbos and occupied it. Without considering the details of the account and the dynamics of the path that the Aeolians took, the Aeolian migration is represented as the succession of descendants from Orestes, Penthilus, Archelaus, Gras, who guided the expedition in order to found Lesbos. According to the account reported by Strabo, the Aeolian polis of Asia Minor and Lesbos too derived from the Aeolians' expeditions, which would have taken place in the generation after the Trojan heroes. However, as we will see, this version comes after the earlier mythical accounts of Lesbos, which can be placed in an age before the Trojan War. According to the local literary tradition, the archaeology of the island is articulated in several phases, which can be scanned taking into account 3 ancient texts. First of all, the excursus relating to the history of Lesbos reported by Diodorus of Sicily, from which we know the 3 phases of the ethnic presence on the island. Firstly came the Pelasgians that conquered the island, which was uninhabited, and gave the name Pelasgia to it, which was already after the universal flood came to the island Macareus, which is presented as the founder of Lesbos. Finally come to the island Devonius hero Lesbos. Let's read the text. When in fact Lesbos was uninhabited, it is said that the Pelasgians first occupied it about in this way. Xanthus, son of Triopas, who reigned over the Pelasgians of Argos, having come to Lesbos, which was uninhabited, called the island Pelagia, which was formerly called Issa, after those who inhabited it. 7 generations later, after the flood at the time of Deucalion and after many men perished, it happened that Lesbos also remained deserted because of the flood. After these events, Macareus settled here. Macareus had within picked people, some Ionians and others who came from the other lineages of all kinds. At first, Macareus settled in Lesbos. In the time, Lesbos, son of Lapithus, having sailed with settlers to the island just mentioned, settled there and named the island Lesbos after himself and called the inhabitants Lesbians. Then, the list of names reported by Plinius the Elder, which give us the ethnic and unethnic phases of the island. Very famous Lesbos, 55 miles away from Chios, was called Imerte and Lasia, Plagia, Egira, Etiope, and Macaria. In the end, Eustathius of Thessalonica provides a series of references that complete the previous text. Once upon a time, Lesbos was called Pelasgia, and the other text, according to the ancient history, once upon a time, Lesbos itself is said to be named as Imerte and Pelasgia, as well as the same island was called Issa. We can observe that tradition of Lesbos preserves the memory of several names assigned to it over time, and that these names are ordered in sequence so to make up a chronologically ordered list. In particular, Pliny's list can be compared with the one that the same historian drew up regarding the city of Miletus in Ionia. Miletus, main city of Ionia, was called before Lelegeis, Pitiusa, and Anactoria. In these lists, each toponym indicates a different chronological level, the first phase, the second phase, and so on. And it is linked to a different ethnic elements. In the case of Miletus, Lelegeis refers to Carians on the land, Anactoria to autochthonous ethnos, while Miletus is the official name. Only the name Pitiusa, which means the island of pines, does not have an ethnic component, but seems to relate to a primordiality connected with the nature of the place. We can find the same pattern in relation to the list of the names of Lesbos, as seen so far. By putting together all these sources concerning the archaeologia of Lesbos, we can say that the first inhabitants of the island were the Pelasgians guided by Xanthus of Argos. This is the earliest phase of populating the island ever. This Pelasgian phase lies between two great eras of Erimia. On one hand, the phase of original desert and primordiality, in which there was no ethnic presence and the island was uninhabited. This phase corresponds to the names Imerte, Lasia, and Issa. And on the other hand, the phase derived from Deucalion's universal flood, represented by the names Egira and Etiope. The proto-colonization of Lesbos by Xanthus extends between these two macrophases for several generations, and it is the time when the island took the name Pelasgia. The sequence of metonymaceae provided by Pliny serves as a diachronic scan for the island's phases and for the ethnic phases that followed one another since the earliest beginnings. Therefore, we identify three main history of the island. Pelasgians first, Macareus then, and finally. Returning to Strabo's account about the migration, the foundation is assigned to Gras, Orestes' great grandson. This is an ancient tradition whose memory was still preserved in the 5th century BC, arrived as fact as the account by Strabo. The origins of a tradition linked to Pentelidae, however, a context related to the archaic age, in which the connection with Orestes and Lesbos were already known. Now we find that Pentelius is already called son of Orestes by the epic poet Sineto from Sparta, who was active around the 7th and 6th century BC. So, just a moment. Okay. Wrote in his verses that Orestes' legitimate son, Pentelius, was born of Erigon, daughter of Aegisthus. This means that the traditions about the Pentelidae were known at the time yet, and that they were perceived as the founders of the island. This seems to be the most ancient tradition about the foundation of Lesbos. Among the traditions of Lesbos, we can find a reference which would have played a leading role in the Aeolian political scenario in the Archaic Age. Following the accepted chronology established by Pierre Carlier, this genus gained power on Mytilene around the first quarter of the 7th century BC. According to the reconstruction made by Santo Mazzarino and Carlier, there is evidence of sources from the century BC, around the same time of Sappho and Alcaeus. The literary sources about the archaic age of Mytilene show that the dominion of the genus of the Pentelidae was part of the city's tradition. As we have seen before from the local genealogy, we know that these Pentelidae were descendants of the founder Pentilus, who led the Aeolian migration. Sappho and Alcaeus are the only us with details about an historical context relating to the 7th century BC, which is difficult to reconstruct due to the lack of the further documentation. The tradition of Pentelidae in Mytilene is well documented, as we can see from the following references. The first one, Sappho, refers to the woman of the Isaac group in competition with the Sapphic one, probably belonging in the second witness. We can see the word pentile, which is understandable. It can be pentilus. And the word pent, presumably linked to pentilus. The last witness is Stephanos of Byzantium, Pentile city of Lesbos. The inhabitants are called Pentilids, named after Pentilus. So the first attestation of 7th century BC, as we can see, led us to suppose that this genus would have created a link with the epic genealogy and thus assigned to themselves descendants from Pentilus, the head of the Aeolian expedition and founder of Lesbos. We can suppose that the Pentelidae, or a genealogist or a mythographer related to them, would have elaborated this tradition, trying their figures of Homeric epos in order to legitimize their power on Mytilene. This historical process is configured as a representation of Lesbos' past. As we have seen, traces of this kind of tradition would be found in the surviving verses of Salphus and Arceus. So we are going to conclude this contribution. In this part, something about the mechanism of representation of Lesbos' history and past. The aim of this paper was to show how in the various historical periods, from the Archaic Age to more recent times, the accounts of the regions of Lesbos have been represented in literary tradition. It was clearly not possible to delve into historical issues that influenced events on the island, such as the period of tyranny or the Sigean War. The case of Lesbos is an example of how identity and history are built and represented, starting from different accounts, but which are in close relationship with the territory on which they developed. The literary tradition has provided a particular representation of the island's thesis, which corresponds of the territory, starting from its origins, with an inhabited phase to the sequence of settlements by others and foundation by Maccabeus and Eos. In Greek traditions, the Pelagian phase is often the one preceding the Greek foundation because it identifies a land held by a non-Greek or more likely a pre-Greek ethnos. The last segment is the one chosen by the community's memory to begin its history. This tradition takes precedence over the others and becomes recognized by the Aeolian area and which allows it to interface with the identity heritage of the rest of Greece. It's a typical mechanism of foundation accounts dating back the origins to an epic ancestor and finding a place for the founder's genealogy, who represents the historical and cultural heritage of the whole community. This makes to go back to a greater to the Trojan War in order to legitimize the foundation and its own historical path. Trying to reconstruct the overview of the foundation accounts about Lesbos, according to what has been shared so far, we can outline an articulation of the ancient history of the island in 5 phases through the toponyms. The first one, Imerte, Lasia, Issa, represented as an regional and linked to primordiality, and there is no settlement of any people. The second, Pelasgia, this name shows the first settlement by Pelasgians. It indicates only the possession of territory, but not a foundation stage, and corresponds to the pre-Greek settlement. Third, the three, Aegira and or Ethiopia, the two names perhaps indicates filler account made by the Deucalion flood. In any case, they indicates no ethnic presence on the island. 4. Macaria. Lesbos is recorded as Macareus settlement, which indicates the first or alternative foundation account and identifies the primitive ethnic identity of the island. 5. Lesbos. The island is represented through the settlement made by the hero Lesbos and an eponymy account. In the 6th phase comes Pentilus, son of Orestes, who guided the Aeolian migration and started a new era. The Aeolians, led by Orestes and the Pentelidae, thus arrived on Lesbos last, after the earlier stages of the archaeologiae described so far. This is the second foundation account of Lesbos, and the one that stood out from the others, namely the official tradition. The previous accounts attempts to date back to a time even earlier than the Aeolian foundation and before the Trojan War. Behind this process lies an attempt to arrive at an origin even older than the Trojan War by means of the inclusion of an earlier or alternative phase to the Aeolian migration. However, this attempt fails because the epic tradition imposes itself as the most widely recognized by the Greek world and thus becomes the representation account and the self-representation account of Lesbos past. According to this scheme, the list of toponyms that correspond to the different phases of Lesbos history can be included within a diachronic grid, showing the different levels of settlement of the island, from a primitive state to the establishment of Pentelidae. Basically, each name carries the reconstruction of the origins of the city, elaborated according to the account that considers an ethnic component. We must also consider that archaeologiae are perceived by the ancient writers as a constructed history, and so it's a history, the foundation of the shared common past and local identity traditions. In this sense, the Aeolian migration represents the watershed from which the Aeolian history begins. This myth becomes the paradigm to which all the local accounts of Aeolian cities in Asia Minor will conform. To conclude, memory and myth in ancient Greece are fundamental in the construction and representation of history and past of a polis or a ethnos. Mythical traditions and genealogy often play an important role in shaping the past to emphasize antiquity or ancestry, as in the case of the Lesbos. They search from a shared common illustrious figure, which is proposed at the basis of ethnic ties. This is not a just mythopoietic process, but is part of an attempt to reconstruct a contemporary historical need, starting from genetic magnetic tiles perceived as ancient system of archaeologia in Thucydides' histories. In any case, when dealing with foundation accounts, sources are often conflicting and contradictory. It is not always possible to reconstruct the real origin of the cities from a strictly historical point of view, but more often that not scraps and fragments of a city's past. We can reconstruct only the representation of the past about a given city, which reflects the community's collective sense of identity in a close link between past, memory, and invention. This is the case of Lesbos, a charming island which has left the memory of its origins that has been preserved for all this century until now.
Thank you so much, Paolo. What a lovely
Beautiful.
paper presentation.
Okay.
We just have a
If,
couple minutes for questions.
okay.
Um,
Thank
if you
you.
do have any questions, please feel free to put them in chat and we will try to pass them on if we don't have time to get to them right now. Um, but I would love very much to hear a little bit about so you've gone very in depth on the various layers of names that we have. Um, I would love to actually hear your opinion on the outcomes of that layering in modern times, um, in the now island of Lesbos, and what it has sort of come to be known as is still retaining that identity, that last one that you talked about.
Yes, thank you for the question. Well, I think that the name Lesbos is the ancient one that it is preserved in modern times because because in Anatolia, so in Turkey, we see often dynamics rethinking of past. And I think that the name Lesbos is the first one attested. It is the most ancient, I think. The other names maybe are filler names because in historiography and so in some sources, literary, mainly literary sources, we can find often situations like this, as I tried to show Miletus, but there are other examples. We can see Samos, Chios, and not only in Asia Minor, but but also in Greece mainland. So
Thank you so much. Um, I'm really interested in how the history of naming of the island um, interacts with the archaeological remains. Do you have a sense of the sort of the timing because of the various settlements that were there in Miletus, in the various other uh, towns around Lesbos? Do you have a sense of that kind of interaction, the material culture versus the nomenclature?
okay, I can. I studied Lesbos for much time. The archaeological data are different from literary sources. We often, when we try to reconstruct the history of a city, we don't um, we can't make a combinatory um, system because it is wrong. It's a wrong way to reconstruct historical context. Relating to Lesbos, archaeological data refers to Mycenaean era, of course, but when we find in sources Pelasgian names, when they are called some people as Pelasgian, the Greek think about their past. So the past is the past of a city usually is linked to Pelasgian phases, as in Ionian cities, in Aeolian cities, and in the Troad too, because there are some cities where we can find sources about that are related to Pelasgians, like Larissa, near to Troy. While the archaeological data are different from this representation, because there are two levels separated, and it is not it's unfair to make to make up reconstruction by archaeological data and literature sources without, of course, without studying the other sources as material culture and other sources, other data. But I was clear when I started the representation, because I wanted to deepen inside the literary sources that are different from archaeological data.
Right. What a fascinating thought, because we so often conflate those two things, the
Yeah, yeah,
way
of
we
course.
talk about something with the material history of it.
Yeah, yeah.
Afraid we're out of time for questions. Thank you so much, Paolo. What a great talk. We're now going to move on to our next presenter in this panel.